I've given as the title of my talk, The Search for Happiness. I imagine we're going to be covering some things that you might not think come under that heading. Aristotle said that all men seek happiness. There are no exceptions. I would agree, but of course we look in different ways, different places for the source of our happiness. And as Christians we know that happiness is a byproduct of obedience. It's not something that we seek as an end in itself. If you love God and you're determined to do what God wants you to do, you're going to find out that the result of your obedience will be happiness, among other things. In Psalm 119, just the first couple of verses in that longest psalm in the Bible, it says, "Happy are they whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord. Happy are they who keep his statutes and seek him with all their heart." Again and again in that psalm and in many other psalms, this same principle is repeated, that happiness is the result of obedience. Any parent can see that in a child. When the child is disobedient, then both the child and the parents are miserable. And as soon as the child capitulates and conforms to what parents are asking him to do, then the child himself finds freedom. My mother used to say that my brother Dave would tune up for a spanking. There was something about my brother Dave that was just particularly mischievous out of all 6 of us kids, and she said that days would go by and he hadn't done anything quite bad enough to get a spanking for, but he would sort of be tuning up. And so finally, as he was getting more and more uncontrollable and miserable, the time would finally come when the spanking had to be administered, and she said it was just wonderful how that completely cleared the air, just like the rain cleared the air and then the sunshine came out, and the obedience was the thing that gave relief. A very simple illustration of what it means for us to find happiness. It is in obedience to God. We know that Adam and Eve chose to disobey. And back there in the Garden of Eden, everything began getting messed up. We've been in an awful mess ever since the Garden of Eden because the roles of men and women were reversed back then. God created Adam to be the initiator. He was to husband Eve, and to husband means to care for, to protect, to provide for, to cherish. He was the one at whose desk the buck stopped, as it were. Eve was created specifically to be a responder to a particular kind of need that God saw in Adam. This puts me in my place. This tells me where I belong. If anybody asks me if I believe in the ordination of women, I say yes, I believe in the ordination of women, as long as we're talking about ordination as being putting in place, and that's what it does mean. The Bible says that God ordained the stars. Well, what does that mean? He set them where they belong. And women need to be set where they belong. Amen, gentlemen? Don't you think that's true? And so do you men. We each need to recognize that God made us amazingly, wonderfully, gloriously unequal and different. Not interchangeable, but most emphatically complementary. Our roles are never meant to be in competition or opposition, but in complementarity. So when God created Eve, He created her from the man, literally, made her out of his bone. He created her for the man. He brought her to the man, and she was named by the man. Now, of course, the world says baloney to all that. The world has been telling us for 20 years that men and women are equal and therefore interchangeable. The feminists are determined to prove not that women are equal, but that they are superior to men. And anything you guys can do, we can do better, is the attitude that seems to come through. And I'm very much aware of the fact that when I speak to young people, I'm speaking to a group of people who have had tremendous pressures and confusions foisted upon them, which I didn't have. I'm an old lady, and 1,000 years ago when I was growing up, there was nothing like the pressures and the foolishness of what the feminist movement has perpetrated upon the rest of us. And I think it has done a real job on this whole area of the search for happiness. Everybody is preoccupied with my needs, my fulfillment, my self-esteem, my happiness, my security. There's an intense preoccupation with the self. A mother came to me and she said, "What would you tell your daughter who is planning to divorce her husband because he doesn't meet all her needs?" And I thought, what a tragedy that any poor woman could get herself into marriage with the notion that somehow or other this fallible human being that she thinks is such a prized package is going to meet all her needs. It's an outrageous expectation. I would certainly try to tell the poor girl that there isn't a man in the world that's ever going to meet all her needs, and I speak from a certain kind of authority, having had 3 very different husbands, and if I had all 3 of them at the same time, Jim and Ad and Lars all at once, they couldn't possibly meet all my needs. I remember Jim saying to me, every woman needs 3 husbands. He said she needs one to love her, one to bring home the bacon, and one to fix things around the house. There isn't any way that a man can do all of those things. There are ideological forces that have led to confusion, and one of the primary ones that has done such a job on all of us is the feminist notion that we are equal, and that the only difference between us is a biological triviality. Well, it is very far from a biological triviality. And I don't want to spend all my time tonight talking about things which are more crucial in marriage than they are in singleness, and yet we are men and we are women, and the dynamics between us are affected by our understanding of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. Heard a wonderful lecture just this last week at Gordon Conwell Seminary by a man named John Piper, who said that the feminist movement has never answered the question that his little boy asked him, "Daddy, what does it mean to be a man and not a woman?" The question that his daughter asks, "What does it mean to be a woman and not a man?" There is a radical distinction here. Now, there's been pressure on women to take more responsibility, which has resulted in pressure on men to take less, because there's only a certain amount of responsibility available in the world, and if women are going to take more, then men are going to take less. And what happened back in the Garden of Eden? Well, it was Satan's suggestion that the route to happiness would be disobedience to God. That was exactly what Satan was suggesting to Eve. God has told you you can't eat the fruit off of that tree. Now, the fruit from that tree is the one that's going to make you happy, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam and Eve were not created to bear the burden of that kind of knowledge. So God, in His mercy and love, had said, don't touch it, just as a merciful, kind father will tell his child, don't play in the street, don't touch the hot stove. Not because he wants to cheat him out of the pleasure of playing in the street or the pleasure of touching the stove, but because he knows that that will destroy him. And God knew that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil would destroy them. But Satan's suggestion was, in effect, you can upgrade your lifestyle. You don't have to be just human beings. You can be like God. And so they declared their independence. They repudiated their created dependence upon God. They took advantage of the freedom to choose which God had created in them, and they chose to defy Him. And it was Eve's idea to follow Satan's suggestion, And so Eve goes to Adam with this idea that they should eat it, and she became the initiator. Women were not made to be the initiators. We were made to be the responders. And Adam, who was supposed to be the husband, whose responsibility was to protect his wife, to surround her, to dig in his heels and to say, no way, Adam became a 4-letter word, a wimp. And he just said, if that's what the little lady wants, that's what the little lady gets. That's what we'll do. He became the responder. The roles were reversed, and we have been in a horrible mess ever since, but it's gotten far worse in the last half of this century because people are vociferously insisting that there is no distinction between men and women, and there's no reason in the world why we women can't do just what you men do, including being the initiators. And my husband and I have heard many sad stories from both men and women which point out the confusion that has been perpetrated through this disobedience. A true man finds true happiness in being true to God, and a true man is one who gives up his right to himself. A true woman also finds happiness in being a true woman under God, not competing for men, with men. Now, very briefly, I just want to give you a few ideas of what femininity means. It means womanliness, and Eve denied her femininity by becoming the initiator. Mary is the example of femininity. Her response to God when the angel came to tell her that she had been chosen to be the mother of the Son of Man was, "Behold the handmaiden of the Lord. Let it happen as you say." The essence of femininity is surrender. And there are tremendous implications for that. I was born an aggressive, manipulative, strong-minded, unsubmissive female. And yet, I know that before I got married the first time, when I fell in love, I realized that what I wanted more than anything else in the world was to surrender myself to a strong man who would be my head. Well, in the providence of God, I have been single many more years than I have been married, even though I now have husband number 3. And during my single years, I'm very keenly aware of the fact that I don't have the privilege of surrendering to a man. And yet, there is that deep-seated femininity, that essence of femininity, which is surrender, that was exemplified in our model, Mary, who is the archetypal woman. We are meant to be submissive to the divine office, and we are meant to love sacrificially. Now that applies also to men. Masculinity means basically responsibility. And there's a very interesting secular book called The Peter Pan Principle, or The Peter Pan Syndrome. Some of you may have seen it, and it's one secular writer's observation that American men are becoming less and less responsible. They don't want to grow up. And this explains the reason why so many men have not chosen marriage, because marriage involves enormous responsibility. My heart goes out to men who have to bring home the bacon and take responsibility for families. I don't know anybody in this room except Nancy Adams, so I have absolutely no idea what your reasons are for being single. And I don't think it's a question that one should ever ask a woman. Why are you still single? And of course, it's none of my business to ask you gentlemen either, but you need to stop and think about whether or not there might be in the back of your mind just a little shred of that disquiet and that unease that has come out of the feminist movement. you really don't know whether you can stand up to these screaming females, and a lot of them are barracudas. And and it is our nature, really, our sinful nature, which began in the Garden of Eden, to become the manipulators and to run everything. And God gave us the most difficult restraining command, because God recognized the nature of our sinful womanliness when He said, submit yourselves to your husbands. It is not natural for us to do this. We don't want to. Now, I just finished saying, I really want to surrender, and on the other hand, I also want to manipulate. This is all part of the confusion of sin. But, on the other hand, God gave to man the most difficult, by far, restraining command when He said, love your wives as Christ loved the church. This means sacrificial love. It means the acceptance of responsibility. And Jesus Christ, as the bridegroom, is the initiator. He is the one who woos. He is the one who calls. He is the one who draws His bride to Himself, gives her His name, and she accepts His destiny. So I see this whole panorama of what the meaning of masculinity and femininity is in terms of the mystery of Christ and the church. And when I speak to married people, I emphasize this. When I speak to singles, I also want to point up to you that this is what femininity and masculinity are all about. If you have questions about that, why, I'll do my best to answer them, but that's putting it as briefly as I possibly can here. I've written 2 books on the subject. One is called Let Me Be a Woman, on the subject of femininity, and one is called The Mark of a Man. Now, the search for happiness ought to be very simple for us Christians, just a matter of obedience. And I want to read a little bit more from that Psalm 119. Happy are they who keep His statutes and seek Him with all their heart. Verse 3, they do nothing wrong, they walk in His ways. You have laid down precepts that are to be fully obeyed. Oh, that my ways were steadfast in obeying your decrees. Then I would not be put to shame when I consider all your commands. I will praise you with an upright heart as I learn your righteous laws. I will obey your decrees. Do not utterly forsake me. How can a young man keep his way pure? By living according to your word. I seek you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commands. I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. Praise be to you, O Lord. Teach me your decrees. With my lips I recount all the laws that come from your mouth. I rejoice in following your statutes as one rejoices in great riches. I meditate on your precepts and consider your ways. I delight in your decrees. I will not neglect your word. Decrees, the obedience to God's decrees is His delight. One of my favorite verses doesn't happen to be this particular translation, but I think it's verse 14 in the New English Bible says, I have found more joy along the path of thy commandments than in any kind of wealth. And that is my testimony. The more faithfully I obey, the more happiness I have found. Now, one of the facts that seems very obvious to me as I read Scripture is that it is assumed that most men will marry. It is assumed that most women will marry. I think it was God's original plan that every man should marry and every woman should have a husband. Things have gotten distorted, and sin and death and destruction have caused all sorts of sorrow along those lines. My husband and I have the opportunity to talk with many young people, both men and women, and we hear just tragic stories of the things that are going on in what I call the dating mess. I I don't know what to do about this, but I'm going to try to make a few suggestions. And because I had a very special opportunity last night to speak with the single women, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity tonight to direct most of my remarks to you gentlemen, and I hope you won't think of me as coming down too hard on you or being a man basher, not by any means, but I would like to be just an old grandmother that might have a few words of help and comfort for you, especially for you men who are timid and fearful. Just last week, we were in Ohio, and we were talking with the man who is the family pastor of the church where I was speaking. And we got on this big subject that I find almost every youth pastor or singles pastor or family pastor has noticed, that there just seem to be a lot of single people around, and it seems as though there are more single people around than there ought to be. And we wonder what's happening. Why is this? You know, we didn't have singles groups in churches 20 years ago. There weren't very many. And the age group is certainly higher. Usually when we thought of a singles group, it was the people under 25 that hadn't gotten married yet. And undoubtedly there are many people here who have been married, so I'm not talking to people who are virgins necessarily. But he was telling us about trying to get the young men to pray seriously about marriage and to observe the godly women in the church. You don't have to go all over the world and smell every rose in the world before you come back and find out that the best rose is the one in your backyard. So he said we've been preaching these things and trying to help them and saying, you know, you guys have got to quit this long-term dating. When you get into marriageable age, let's say anywhere beyond 21, you're certainly of marriageable age, although very few men seem to be thinking about it much before 30 nowadays. But let's face it, you do want to be considered adults when you're 16 when it comes to the voting age and the drinking age and getting your driver's license. You'd like everyone to think you are a full-grown man at that point. Certain things you may not be recognized as a man until you're 18 or at least 21, but certainly not later than 21. At that point, you need to be getting serious. And he said, I just asked him, what are you looking for? Just look down the row there, you'll see it. You know, there she is. There's a whole bunch of wonderful Christian girls. Well, there were 3 particular men that he had been dealing with, working with on this subject, and all of them had been dating a girl. Each of them had been dating somebody for many months or even years, a year or more. And he, in effect, just said to these guys, look, you gotta fish or cut bait. And they were terrified. So they cut bait. They just broke it off. That was the end of that. But he said, it took those guys, all 3 of them, this happened, that the same pattern exactly took place. He said within 2 weeks, after having broken up with these girls, all 3 of these guys said to themselves, I am the biggest wimp in the world. I'm never going to do better than this. What do I think I'm going to find? I have just lost a godly woman. And all 3 of these men went back and proposed to those women, and they're all 3 of them married now. And this just happened within a matter of months. Now, this is not an impossibility, but we're talking about Christians. We're talking about people who have access to the throne of God. And God has told us that He will guide us. In Psalm, let's see, do I have a marker in here? Psalm 143. Let's see. Teach me, verse 10, Psalm 143, verse 10, teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your good spirit lead me on level ground. Psalm 25 is a wonderful psalm on guidance, and I'm not going to read all these now, but let no one whose hope is in you ever be put to shame. For the sake of your name, O Lord, forgive my iniquity. He guides the humble in what is right and teaches them his way. All the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful for those who keep the demands of his covenant. God understands your fears. God understands your reservations. Some of you are very likely not in a financial position to be getting married. But you don't have to have everything that your parents have when you get married. You can get along on a shoestring if you're prepared to make sacrifices. Back at the end of the 19th century, a man named Charles Alexander was the song leader with D.L. Moody. And as he traveled around the world, he was looking for a wife. From the ages of 21, I think it was 20 or 21 to 27, he was traveling around the world constantly with D.L. Moody as the song leader. And he really wasn't in one place long enough to find a wife. But he had a long list of qualifications that he thought that he would find somewhere, sometime. But by the time he got to be 27 years old, he thought, I need to surrender this list, my list, and ask God for his list. And he got down on his knees. He was in London at the time. He got down on his knees and he said, Lord, you know that this is the wife I think I need. But Lord, you know the wife I really do need. So I am surrendering my list to you. And this isn't exactly the way he put it, but something of this nature. And he said, now Lord, you lead me to the wife of your choice. Within a day or two, he was on the platform when a very attractive young woman was also seated on the platform, and she had been asked to give a testimony. He watched her and felt very likely this is God's answer to my prayer. He did not know her name. He'd never had a conversation with her. But she got up and gave her testimony and sat down. He was absolutely convinced that this was the woman that God had for him. Now, what did he know about her? Well, he knew, number one, that she was a Christian. Number two, that she was feminine. It doesn't take very long to find that out. She had given her testimony, so he knew where she stood spiritually. And he thought it's reasonable to believe that God will answer my prayer, and that this perhaps is the answer. And so he went home that night to the beautiful mansion where he was staying and asked his hostess if she knew this lady. And the hostess said, yes, she happens to be my niece. And he said, would you introduce me to her? She did. He asked her to have dinner with him, and he proposed. And he said, it was all settled. He said, we were on our knees within 5 minutes, and the whole thing was settled. Now that's the 19th century, and of course you can't imagine that God could ever do anything like that in the 20th century. So I have another story. We have students who live in our house, one by one, and one of our recent students had to drive me to a speaking engagement in New Hampshire, and as we were driving, he began asking me questions about courtship and marriage and how does a man approach a woman. And I was dishing out my usual advice to this young man. And I knew, and here's the crucial thing, and don't forget this. Don't go out of here saying that Elizabeth Elliot says you've got to propose to the next girl you see or whatever, unless you fulfill the qualification of a man of prayer. That's what we're talking about. This man, Charles Alexander, was a man of prayer. And this particular student was a man of prayer. I knew this because he used to take his Bible and go down on the rocks, sometimes for hours. I would see him down there. We live on the ocean, and from my study window I could see this man down there with his Bible and his hymn book, and he was a man of prayer. And I knew that he had been praying very earnestly about marriage. He happened to be from another country in the kind of place where there was a lot of pressure on him to get married. Nobody even thinks about being single in that culture. And his parents were coming down on him, and so he felt that the time had perhaps come when God wanted to give him a wife, so he was praying about this. So when we went on this ride up to my speaking engagement, he raised a question. He said, do you think it's possible for a man to fall in love with a woman to whom he doesn't really feel any particularly strong attraction? And I said, yes, of course. You have to realize that most of the world, through most of human history, has had marriages arranged. There's never been any such thing as falling in love. That didn't have anything to do with marriage, except in very recent history and in a very small portion of the world. Marriages are still arranged in India and other places. And so I said, yes, you don't have to have any special strong attraction, let alone physical attraction to the woman. And he asked me various other questions, and he said, well, you know, there is a girl that, as I've been praying that the Lord would lead me to the right wife, he said, this girl keeps coming across my path in one way or another, and it's in very ordinary, legitimate ways. He happened to be one of the leaders of a group in the church, a youth group, and she happened to be there, and he said, I took her home one time along with a group of other people that needed to ride. And he said, in one way or another, when I get down to pray, he said, her face keeps coming to mind, her name keeps coming to mind, but he said, I don't find her very attractive. And I would never pick her out by myself, but I'm asking God for His choice. Well, a few days later, he came upstairs to tell me that he was planning to go home the following weekend. Was that okay? And I said, fine. But then he kept standing there, and he looked at me with a kind of a funny look, and he said, well, you probably want to know why I'm going home. I said, no, it's none of my business why you're going home. Well, he said, I'll tell you why I'm going. He said, I'm taking her down to meet my parents. And I said, her? Who's her? And he said, well, the girl that I was telling you about. He hadn't mentioned her name or anything. And I said, well, my goodness, some things must have happened pretty fast since 2 or 3 days ago when we took that ride. You wouldn't be taking her to meet your parents unless you were planning, or you were pretty serious about thinking of her as a prospective wife. Am I right? And he said, yes. He said, in fact, what I didn't mention to you the other night was that I had already proposed to her. Well, I said, tell me that story. He said, the more I prayed, the more convinced I was that this was God's answer. I was asking Him to show me the right woman, and the woman that I would never have chosen myself kept being brought into my prayers. And so he said, I asked her to go for a walk with me on the beach, and he said she was a little taken aback, but she said yes, and we started down the beach, and I said, will you marry me? And she was thunderstruck, but she didn't say no. She said, well, I'll have to pray about it. I'll have to think about it. She had absolutely no preparation whatsoever. Well, then later on we had another ride. He had to take me to the airport somewhere. And so he said, you know, the most amazing things have happened. By that time she had given him her answer, which was yes. And so they were officially engaged. But he said, you know, I have this, it's really weird, the things that are happening to me. He said, I have just discovered in this woman a beauty and a godliness and all kinds of qualities that I had no idea were there. He said, she blesses me. He said, she builds me up spiritually. I didn't know she was very spiritually minded. I didn't know any of these things about her. Now, who did that? It was God. But the crucial qualification was a man who was dead serious, and he was not dating anybody. And to me, that's a sign of very deep seriousness when a man says, okay, I've had it on this dating business, one thing after another, serial breakups and relationships, you know, and this relationships word is a very dangerous word. The minute you call something a relationship, you need to be able to define it. And as I talk to young people, I find that very often they can't. And I point out that in the Bible, there are only 3 possible relationships between a man and a woman. And one of them has nothing to do with one-to-one. It's the relationship between brother and sister. We are all, as members of the body of Christ, brothers and sisters. Every man in this room who is a Christian is my brother. I don't have a special relationship with a brother. If I did, I would be treading on very dangerous ground. The only other two relationships that there are betrothal and marriage, and that's the one-to-one thing. I know that in the minds of many of you, the question is, well, how can you ever move to the relationship of betrothal unless you've had a relationship before that? It's been done millions of times. It's never happened that there had to be any special relationship between a man and a woman before the choice is made. How did Abraham's servant find the wife for Isaac? He went to where women could be observed in a tactful, socially acceptable way, which was at the village well. And he waited quietly, he waited silently, and watched and prayed quietly. Now, in a church, there are socially acceptable opportunities for observation. I knew that Jim Elliot was the man I wanted to marry before I ever had even a conversation with him. My observation of his character told me all kinds of things. I watched him in dining hall lines, memorizing scripture from little white cards or Greek verbs. I saw, here's a man that doesn't want to waste his time. I could watch him in his function as president of the Foreign Missions Fellowship. He was a man of spiritual depth. I could watch him in class, the way he treated professors, the way he treated other girls, the way he treated guys. I watched him on the wrestling mat, and my brother Dave told me some things about him that absolutely clinched it. I learned things from Dave that I wouldn't have known from Jim himself, but Dave said, this guy gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning to read his Bible and pray. And I thought to myself, Lord, this is the kind of a man that I hope you'll give me someday. I had never had a date, and Jim and I only had one date in our whole college experience, and that was to a missionary meeting at Moody Church in Chicago. He didn't buy me an ice cream cone or a meal or anything else. He didn't have enough money. He probably had the 65 cents or whatever it cost to pay for the train tickets, and that was it. We went to the missionary meeting, and we went back, and he took me to the dorm. Period. Case closed. So it was observation. Now I can tell you one more story, and I'm going to quit and give you a chance for questions. My father, and I've just finished writing a book about my parents and the kind of home that they established, and I really had never read all the data that there was on how my parents got together, but my father had met my mother in a casual social situation several times. She was a good friend of a lady named Margaret, who was a friend of my father's also. In fact, when my mother, whose name was Catherine, first met Phil Howard, she thought that Phil Howard and Margaret Haynes were a pair, that they were going to be getting married one of these days. Well, back in my mother's day, there was no such thing as dating on a one-to-one basis, unless there was a chaperone. There were always chaperones around, so there was nothing like the intimacy and the privacy that couples have today. So she saw my father on a number of different occasions in different places, meetings and at Margaret Haynes' home and other people's home. Well, Mrs. Haynes invited my father and a number of other young people to her beautiful summer place in Maine for what they used to call a house party. My father was one of the earlier arrivals, and as Margaret and my father were standing on the dock waiting for the arrival of another guest, and the boat pulled in, and my mother, Catherine, came down the gangplank. My father, standing there next to his friend Margaret, said, "There is the girl I'm going to marry." He said this to himself, not to Margaret. And this was Thursday. On Saturday, he asked my mother if she would go for a walk with him, and she said, sure. And she collected everybody at the house party, and they all went for a walk. Well, on Sunday, my father asked my mother if she would go to church with him. And she thought, what is it with this guy, but sure, she said. So she collected everybody, and they all went to church together. Well, my father had to leave the next morning, and so in desperation, he said, would you go to church with me tonight alone? And she thought, this guy really is, there's something strange about this, because she had no inkling that he had any interest in her. She was convinced that he was going to marry Margaret. So they walked to church, and he said, I love you. Will you marry me? And she was as thunderstruck as the other girl that I told you about, and she said, well, I can't possibly give you an answer. She didn't say no, but she kept him waiting for 6 weeks, and then she said yes. Now what are the dynamics here? A man of prayer. A man who never dated. My father was the world's shyest, timid man. He was 6'4". He had one eye, a glass eye. He had a glass eye and his one eye that was a good eye. And he was absolutely convinced he would never be able to get a girl. And my mother was a very beautiful woman and had had three proposals before my father came along. But he prayed, and he believed that God would answer his prayer. And that's what I'm saying to you gentlemen tonight. I do believe that, I don't know how many men there are in this room tonight, but there might be some of you who have a specific call to celibacy. It's a rare thing, and I would not gainsay that possibility. But for most of you, it is undoubtedly the will of God that the majority of you should marry. Now, how do you go about it? You pray. And you watch quietly. And you pray earnestly. Now, where do you have to go to find these godly women? Here they are. Attractive women, godly women, feminine, women who are not angry about being a woman. What is it that you need? Well, God knows the woman you need. And so, in the name of Christ, I ask you most earnestly to consider your responsibility. It is scary. No man is adequate for this. No man can do the job of being a husband and a father and a provider without the grace of God. But the grace of God is available. So, fish or cut bait. And don't go fishing all over the place. I think one of the things that Lars and I have talked about so many times is, how long does it take you? 2 months? 3 years? 5 years? We talked to a young man who told us he'd met the most wonderful woman in the world. She had all the qualifications he was looking for in a wife, and he'd been dating her for 2.5 years. And we said, well, have you asked her to marry you? And he said, well, I can't do that. And we said, why not? He said, because I don't know how she feels about me. And Lars said, well, I'll tell you a real fast way to find out. Just tell her you love her. Will you marry me? You'll find out. And my father gave my 4 brothers one piece of advice. He said, do not ever tell a girl, I love you, until you're ready to follow that revelation with the question, will you marry me? Okay? The search for happiness will be, you will discover happiness in obedience to God. And if God is calling you to put away childish things, settle down, accept the full responsibility of masculinity, which, generally speaking, is husbandhood and fatherhood, then seek His will. Find your joy in obedience.